G'day folks, it's Indiana Joe here from Creation Research. What you're about to watch is part of our new exhibition on living fossils. Now, give you a brief little bit of background. You see, the idea of the Creation Research Museums project is that we have a network of museums all around the world, and currently, as of 2023, we have about 6 in the making. However, in the UK, it's headed up by the Creation Research Centre in Oswestry, where we are housed over 35,000 fossils and artefacts. Now, the plan for the UK is a bit like a mini version of the International Museum Ministry, where we have our one central museum in Oswestry, which designs all of these exhibitions, which can travel around a network of museums around the country, supported by local churches. Now, I'm telling you this for 2 reasons. Number one, if you're watching this in the UK and you have a church who might be interested in partnering with us as the Creation Research UK Museums project and would like to host one of these exhibitions, then get in touch with us at info@creationresearchuk.com. But secondly, the other reason we're telling you this is because as we continue with the museums project, we are developing these new exhibitions. And the idea is that they focus on one particular topic and have the ability to travel all around. Well, this year we did one on living fossils. So what you're about to see is me, Indiana Joe, taking a group of people around a tour of our brand new exhibition, The World of Living Fossils. Hope you enjoy it, hope you discover some brand new pieces of evidence to add to your arsenal, and get behind the museums project in the UK and support us, because we wouldn't be able to do it without your help. Enjoy. Welcome to the Living Fossils exhibition, which these are all fossils from our Creation Museum in Oswestry, and we're going to sort of go around and talk about what living fossils are. But we're not going to start with a living fossil, because we're going to start with the 2 dinosaurs here. You can see Claudia. Claudia is the big giant dinosaur, who is the Hollywood version of a velociraptor. Some of you will have seen these kinds of depictions of dinosaurs, because even though Jurassic Park and the Hollywood films are Hollywood and science fiction, this idea and thinking about dinosaurs has translated into what is effectively modern layman science. And what I mean by that is, if you look at books, if you look at books on dinosaurs, if you go to museums, you often see these creatures depicted like this, as these large, ferocious beasts. In fact, this particular model we actually got off of the world's biggest dinosaur sculpting company, which produces dinosaurs for museums. And the starting point that we say in the first sign here is, the lies that they tell you, beware. Because the reality is, Velociraptor was not a 5.5 foot tall, ferocious looking creature like Claudia. You can actually see the little one on the table there. That is pretty much spot on with the size of actual velociraptors. Now, what's funny about this is that Velcy, the little velociraptor there, she was actually marketed, we got her on eBay, right? She was marketed as the official Jurassic World colossal dinosaur toy. And the reality is they'd made her pretty much spot on with exactly what size a velociraptor is. Now, if they have lied to us about one area of science, particularly in layman science, where else have they actually lied to us about? And so we're going to start with the Bible. We're going to start with Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, which says, "Let this mind be in you that is also in Christ." So we need to start from a biblical perspective. We need to start by having the mind of Christ in us, so that we can go on to investigate other things like living fossils. So we're going to start properly in Genesis, where it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." We're, of course, talking about Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. It goes on to describe how God made the light, and he divided the light from the darkness. He went on to day 2 and the division of the waters, and then on day 3, it says that God creates the dry land. And it says in verse 11, "Then God said, let the earth bring forth grass and herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind, whose seed is in itself on the earth, and it was so. And the earth brought forth grass, the herb that yields seeds according to its kind, and the tree that yields fruit, whose seed is in itself according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Day 4, of course, God creates the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, and all the stars. And then you get down to verse 21, and it talks about God on day 5 of creation creating the birds and the fish. And it says, God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. Now, it then goes on to describe the animals, and guess what they're created according to? Their kind, right? Now, it's an interesting phenomena here, because if God says something once in his word, you should pay attention. If God says something 10 times in one relatively short chapter, he's really trying to drive a point home, right? And 10 times in Genesis chapter 1, it says that God created living things to reproduce, God created things according to their kind and commanded them to reproduce according to their kind. That phrase, according to their kind, comes up 10 times in Genesis chapter 1. So it really is something we ought to pay attention to and input into the real world, because one of the best questions to ask, if you're debating an atheist, or you're debating an evolutionist, or you're debating somebody who doesn't believe the Bible is true, one of the best questions to ask them is, if God really did create like he said he did, what evidence would you go looking for? You know, 99.9% of scientists haven't even thought to think about that question. And something I encourage people to realise is that if you don't ask the right questions, you'll never find the right answers. You see, we live in a world today where it's promoted that there is lots and lots and lots of evidence for evolution, but nobody's ever stopped to think about the other side. What would the evidence be if God really did create creatures according to their kind? The answer is living fossils, and we'll talk about what that is. And this whole exhibition is set up with living fossils. Okay, so where do living fossils, or the term living fossils, come from? It actually comes from Charles Darwin himself. You've all heard of Charles Darwin? Many people think that he invented the theory of evolution. Chris, did Charles Darwin invent the theory of evolution?
No, it was around for a very, very long time before him, and his grandfather had also discovered it in things that he read from the past.
And in fact, I'm looking forward to reading Chris's new book, Dr. Darwin's Assistant, which I got a gift of just a few days ago. So I'm looking forward to read that, because I know that Chris has done great research into this, and it is really true. The idea of evolution way predates Charles Darwin. But Charles Darwin really, if he can be accredited with one thing, is promoting, popularising the theory of evolution, of course, in his famous book On the Origin of Species, which is not the full title. The full title is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or The Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. If you know your English, you'll realise that that title doesn't actually make sense. But anyway, in his book, on the theory of evolution, on the origin of species, about the theory of evolution, he promoted this idea of change, that creatures change over time, and that given enough time, simple changes, small changes, can lead to big changes. But he noticed a problem. He wrote in one of the chapters that there are these anomalous forms. He said these anomalous forms could almost be called the living fossils, because they have endured to the present day. In other words, he recognised that not all fossils supported his theory. And he said that these should be anomalies. In fact, he thought that they were anomalies. But as you can see just from the tiny fraction of the collection that we have here today, these are not anomalies by any stretch of the imagination. This is the norm. And in fact, even fossils that aren't living fossils still show that biblical concept of after their kind, and we'll find out more about that as we go. In fact, a little while later, Charles Darwin said that his theory did not depend on necessarily the strongest creature surviving, but the one that was most adaptable to change. In other words, the whole theory of evolution is based around this concept of creatures changing. What we see with the living fossils is evidence that these creatures didn't change. So we're going to go forward and look at examples of these fossils and explore a few concepts within living fossils as we go. A quick note, because I had to put this up, you will notice as we go around, all of the fossils have got little labels with them. And the labels start with the name. They start with the common name. Some of them have the Latin name, particularly the genus name, and we'll talk more about what genus means in a little bit. Then it's got the location where it's from. So the guitarfish, which we'll see over there, is from the Jurassic rocks in the Solnhofen in Germany. And then underneath I've put the supposed age. Now the supposed age is the age according to evolution, and we'll talk a little bit more about where we get this age from. But just as a disclaimer, I want you to know that I do not believe that these fossils are actually, well, any age up to 150 million years and beyond. The reason I've put the age there is very simple. If you read the rock layers as a history of time, then the bottom rocks are the oldest, the top rocks are the youngest. And if you read the rocks as a history of time, then your fossils fit in at different time points. Now, there's a big assumption around that, and again, we'll talk more about that later. But the reason that I've put the dates there is so that you can see it doesn't matter how old you make the rocks. There are still living fossils in them. Whether it's 150 million years, whether it's 3 million years, or we have one fossil over here that's supposed to be 2.5 billion years old. And the reason I've put that there is to show you that it doesn't matter how old you want to make the rocks, the theory of evolution does not stack up to actual evidence. So that's a little disclaimer about those labels. So let's come on down here to the first table here. Because we're going to talk a little bit more about what it means to be created after its kind. If you have a look at this table, you should be able to recognize most of the things on it. Without looking at the labels, you'd probably be able to tell that this was some kind of a turtle or tortoise shell. Now, would you know, without the label being there obviously, that it was some kind of a turtle or tortoise shell? Because it looks like one. Ah, okay. Well, this one's a little bit trickier unless you know your Australian plants, but you might be able to recognise this as a cycad fossil. The cycads are still alive today. They live in Australia. And how would you know that this was a cycad fossil? Because it looks like one. Very good. What is this?
Brittle stars.
Brittle stars, some kind of starfish. All right, how would you know that these are brittle stars? Come on, this is going to be the same answer. We've got about 400 fossils here, and it's the same answer for all of them, right? Because it looks like one. We're not going to go through all of them, don't worry. But the point is very simple. I do this particularly with young people, and sometimes with older people as well, and I get them to repeat it back because it looks like one. And it really is that simple. You see, truth is simple. If you are trying to make a complicated concept about something, chances are it's not quite right. The truth really is simple, and it's simple. These are starfish, and we know they're starfish because they look like starfish, and we know what starfish look like because they're still alive today. Now, these are supposed to be in the Ordovician. The Ordovician is supposed to be around 450 million years old. But all you have proven is that in 450 million years, starfish, or brittle stars, have turned into brittle stars. They haven't changed at all. They haven't evolved at all. And if you've been stuck in a rut for 450 million years, you're not likely to evolve anytime soon. You see, there really is no evidence for evolution when it comes to brittle stars. But let's leave the idea of evolution behind for a minute. Let's go to what a kind is. Because like I said, 10 times in Genesis chapter 1, it says that God created things according to its kind. What does a kind mean? Well, it's actually a scientific term. Now, it's a scientific term because Carl Linnaeus, who scientifically invented, or Carl von Linné, who scientifically invented our modern classification system, from kingdom at the top all the way down to species at the bottom, he hinged his entire classification system, which was his attempt to try and organise the world around him, he hinged it all onto a binomial system. That means two naming system. The binomial system is genus and species, right? He had a binomial system for animals. Now that word genus is interesting. We still use that word today, right? So if you think, what genus are we, if you think of us as scientifically as animals, what genus are we? Homo. What species are we? Sapien or sapien, yeah, okay. Well, put that into dog then. What's the genus of a dog? Anybody know? Canis. What's the species? lupes, Canis lupes, and in fact, Canis lupes is actually not really the dogs, Canis lupes is the wolf, the grey wolf. Okay, what's the little dogs that we have? Well, they're also Canis lupes. They're Canis lupes familiaris, because they are actually recognised still as the same species as the wolf, but they've become so degenerate to the point where they're pugs and poodles that they've gone, we can't possibly insult the wolf by calling it exactly the same name, we better give them a variation name. It's a variation of that species. The old scientific concept was race, and so it's a particular variation race, and we've called them Canis lupus familiaris. All right. Bring this back to the biblical concept. Where did this idea of kind and genus come from? Well, the answer is Carl Linnaeus was a Christian. He read his Bible. Of course, being from the 1700s and the continent, most of his Bible he was reading was in Latin. And if you open up your Latin Bible and you're able to read Latin, you'll read that God created things according to their, well, the word kind is an English word, it's not a Latin word. So where the word kind is in your Latin Bible, you'll find the word genus. It says that God created things according to their genus. And so Carl Linnaeus said, this is a great idea. I'm going to take this biblical concept of kind and form my classification system around this biblical concept of kind. He said, in the beginning, God created things according to their genus. I'm going to say that there are genuses, there are groups of genuses, they are a group, they are a kind, and it's clear that this kind is able to diversify. It's clear that this kind is able to change within its limitations, so there's a special type of kind, or a special type of creature within that kind. And so he called it species, which comes from our word special, the same root word from our word special. So you have kind and a special variation of that kind, which is where we get genus and species from. This is a scientific concept, right? Now, in our world today, where does this fit in? Because we've come quite a way along with our classification system than Carl Linnaeus. And we keep chopping and changing stuff around all the time. And it can get very confusing. And then genetics comes in and so on and so forth. And we keep rebranding stuff. So if you want a very, very simple explanation, the concept of created kind will be somewhere between family and genus in our modern classification system. Sometimes it is at the genus level, sometimes it's clearly they are one kind, but it's because we've divvied them up so much it takes it back to the family level. But the reality is we need to take off our evolutionary glasses, which reads the classification system in a way that Carl Linnaeus never meant it to be read. Carl Linnaeus was trying to organise the world around him. Today, we view the classification system, or secular scientists view the classification system as a way of showing relation between animals in an evolutionary timeline. This idea that you have simple creatures at the top, your overarching kingdoms, which evolve down into the creatures we see today. And Carl Linnaeus never meant it to be like that. He meant to base it, and he did base it, off of a biblical concept. So we need to take off our evolutionary glasses, we need to put on our biblical glasses, let this mind be in you that is also in Christ, start viewing the world the way that God views the world, and think, okay, if God really did create according to its kind, what evidence would we be looking for? And if God created for creatures to reproduce after their own kind, in other words, have babies that look like themselves, what evidence would we be looking for? The answer is, we'd be looking for evidence of creatures from the past that haven't changed to the present day. And that's what living fossils are. So now we've established what that biblical concept is, let's move around and have a look at some of these fossils. So just take a couple of minutes just to have a slow wander around this table here, and we'll come back at this table and talk more about some of the individual bits on this table. So just have a little wander around the table. There's actually another piece of evidence on this table. Not just living fossils. Of course, living fossils show us that creatures don't change, they don't evolve. But there's another piece of evidence on this table, and it has to do with the jellyfish. Anybody want to guess as to what the piece of evidence is? Rapid burial. How many of you have been to the beach and seen jellyfish washed up on the sand? How long do they hang around for? Not very long. They shrivel up and dry, particularly in the sun. Why? Because they're made of jelly, or they are gelatinous in their consistency, right? They're mostly water. They are built together. They're very, very what we call soft-bodied. So in order to preserve a jellyfish, are you able to wash one up on the beach and leave it there for a little while? No, because you're never going to get a fossil jellyfish. If you want a fossil jellyfish, you need to bury it quickly, you need to bury it deeply, you need to bury it without the presence of oxygen, and you need to bury it with the right process. And if you're listening on how to fossilize your pet, and you happen to have a pet jellyfish, you now know all how to fossilize it. But anyway, what we have here, rapid burial is definitely a key point, but what we have here are 3 different types of jellyfish from 3 different locations, and we have 4 specimens. The first one is from the Cambrian in Morocco, and this is the oldest one on the table supposedly, at a supposed 500 million years old. Now, the Cambrian is interesting. Anybody want to guess as to what the Cambrian is or is named after? The Cambrian rocks, or Cambrian rocks. Go on, you know. Yes, basically Wales, right? The old Welsh name, Cymru, right? The Latinization of that was Cambri, and so it became Cambrian, or Cambrian. That's why you'll see the term Cambrian all around Wales, right? So these are not named after anything to do with evolution, they're named after do with their location. And it's true, we have Cambrian rocks round here, or Cambrian rocks round here. Now, there's another point as well. At 500 million supposed years, this puts this as part of the Cambrian explosion. Now, this is a big problem for evolution because what you have is you have layers and layers and layers of rocks with no fossils in them whatsoever. Now, what is evolution supposed to be? Slow, gradual change over millions of years. And so you'll find in the Precambrian there's masses of rocks and there's no fossils whatsoever. And then bang, suddenly there is every example of every major phylum that we have alive today in the Cambrian rocks. Now, number 1, you have no explanation as to how life started. Number 2, you have no explanation as to where all these creatures came from. And number 3, a lot of them are living fossils, just like the Cambrian jellyfish. 500 supposed million years, and are jellyfish still here? Yes, they are. And they have remained unchanged. Now, if you want to skip 50 million years into the future from the Cambrian, of course I'm dealing with supposed ages here, you find yourself in the Ordovician. And the Ordovician is also named after Wales, sort of. You have the old Celtic tribes that used to live around the British Isles. Yeah? One of the tribes that lived in Wales was called the Ordovici tribe. So that's what these rocks are named after, the Ordovician rocks. Nothing to do with millions of years of evolution. And look, jellyfish. Have they changed in 50 million years? No, they haven't. In fact, they haven't changed in 450 million years because they're still alive today. And we can skip even further forward in time, all the way to a supposed 150 million years ago, and you find more jellyfish. This time from the Jurassic rocks in the Solnhofen in Germany. Have they changed in that time? No, they haven't. They're still jellyfish. Now, a couple of other things we'll point out on this table. Have a look at the nautiluses down the front here. Now, the nautiluses are interesting because they are actually the original living fossil. And what I mean by that is they are the original creature that Charles Darwin commented on about the fact that they hadn't changed. Now, the big giant one in the rock on the back is actually one from the UK. This is from Lyme Regis and Charmouth Way, right, the Jurassic coast. So it's Jurassic. Now, what does Jurassic mean? What are the Jurassic rocks named after? The Jura Mountains in Germany. Nothing to do with millions of years. You get my point here, right? The rocks were originally named by scientists who were predominantly Christian, who were predominantly creationists, and they named the rocks, they gave the rocks names based on the rock type, not on the rock ages. So the Jurassic rocks are the rocks like the ones in the Jura Mountains, and you can trace the Jurassic rocks all around the world. The shiny ones, the shiny rock nautiluses down there, are known as Cretaceous nautiluses, and they're from Madagascar. Cretaceous, the Latin word for chalk is Creta, and you'll find that a lot of the Cretaceous rocks are chalk, and almost all of the chalk rocks are Cretaceous, right?
Is that like crustaceans?
I don't think so. No, no. I think I think that's slightly different. Yes.
What do horseshoe crabs eat?
What do horseshoe crabs eat? Little things that they find buried in the sand. Little bits like little tiny fish scales and rotting. They're scavengers like most crabs, so they'll eat rotting bits of fish and all sorts as they scuttle along the bottom of the sea. But going back to nautiluses, you can actually see we've also got two modern examples there. So this is actually a cephalopod. Cephalopod, anybody know what a cephalopod is? You know what a cephalopod is? Give me an example of a cephalopod. A squid, yeah, a squid or an octopus, right? They're cephalopods, cuttlefish, right? So this is a shelled cephalopod. So you'll see you've got your shell like this. You see the big chamber in there? That's where the creature lives, sticks his tentacles out, and he moves himself along in this direction, right? The ammonites were shelled cephalopods. And the nautilus is one of the only shelled cephalopods that we have alive today. But you notice the point, right? You have Jurassic rocks, which are supposed to be, what is it? This is Lyme Regis Jurassic, so it's nearly 200 million years old. It's 199 million years, plus or minus 1 or 2 million years, because that's what we're allowed to do in geology. I hope you realise in geology you're allowed up to a 40% margin of error. In medical science, you're allowed 1. The reason why is because if you get more than 1% margin of error in medical science, you're liable to kill somebody, right? So you just notice how arbitrary sometimes science is, especially with like geology, where it really doesn't matter, right? That 40% margin of error, by the way, is in relation to radioactive dating and radiometric dating, so that's a whole other topic. But anyway, your point is we have something which is nearly 200 million years old, and it's still alive today. We have the Cretaceous ones, which are 70 to 100 million years old, and they are still alive today. They haven't actually changed. We've also got the squid. The squid is also from the Solnhofen in Germany, the original Jurassic rocks. We have the guitarfish, again, the original Jurassic rocks, around 150 to 155 million years old, supposedly haven't changed one bit. So it's good evidence that creatures don't change. Instead, what they do is reproduce after their own kind, right? Because let's face it, if you are 500 million years old, if you are 155 million years old, if you are 200 million years old, and you haven't changed one bit, then you're not likely to change anytime soon. You're stuck in a rut. You're not evolving. What you are doing is doing exactly what God told you to do when he created you, which is reproduce after your own kind. But I want to just backpedal a little bit into geology. You realize that the theory of evolution was only made possible because people believed that the Earth was very old. Now, the age of the Earth and the Earth being very old had nothing to do with scientific evidence, and we know this because none of the scientific methods currently used for supposedly dating the rocks to millions of years old were invented when people first believed that the rocks were millions of years old. You hear words like radiometric dating, radioactive dating, carbon-14 dating is often claimed, particularly by the layman, to prove millions of years. No scientist would use it to prove millions of years, by the way, because it can't date to millions of years, but that's a whole other topic. My point is simple. People believed that the Earth was very old before they knew how old they wanted it to be. They knew that it had to just be old. And as a result of that, Charles Darwin walked through the door and said, well, if the Earth is really old, then given enough time, creatures can evolve over vast amounts of time. And you realise what we're looking at is evidence that creatures don't evolve. So what do you think that does to the dates? They're simply not needed. There's no evidence that these creatures are 500 million years old. The argument is that it takes 500 million years for jellyfish to evolve into people. But have they evolved into people? No, they're still jellyfish. And there's no evidence that people have evolved from anything other than people. In other words, we haven't evolved at all. We were created in the image of God, and we were created to reproduce and fill the earth after our kind, just like the rest of the creatures that God made. All right, let's move on to another fascinating part of living fossils. So if you want to come and gather around here, Sarah, and if you come here maybe. That's it, guys. Come gather around, make a path to come so everybody can see. I'll hold things up, but there's a big gap here which you can come in to see. These are all examples, just a few examples, of what I think are one of the most fascinating living fossils of all, the stromatolites. What are stromatolites? Well, they are a type of algae. And as they grow, they secrete minerals. In other words, they basically secrete rock. And the rock builds up in layers, and the algae lives on the top and continues to secrete rock, and the rock builds up and up and up in layers as it goes. They are effectively a living creature. They are effectively a living thing. But they are producing rock. They are fossilizing themselves as they grow. Look at it that way. Now, stromatolites are still alive today. That's how we know what they are. They live on the west coast of Australia. You can see a picture of some of the modern stromatolites. And these on the table are all examples of fossil stromatolites. How do we know that they're stromatolites? Because they look like stromatolites. They are identical in every way. So we will start with one of the so-called youngest stromatolites here, which are these ones here. This is actually a British one. It's called beetroot stone, because it sometimes comes a nice sort of pinky kind of colour. It's from Gloucestershire. Can you see all the little weird lines on it? Yeah, those lines are where the algae has built up rock. Here's another one from Germany. Again, the Jurassic. You see the strange lines on there? Again, these are supposed to be 150 million years old. So, has there been any evolution in 150 million years? No, there hasn't. All right, well, let's take it up one step older to these ones, which are known as the Cotham marble. This is also a British example. Can you see all the layers? Now, these are supposed to be Triassic, and the Triassic is supposed to be around 215 million years old. Has there been any evolution? No, there hasn't. All right, well, let's step it up a little bit more to a Scottish one, which is the Carboniferous rocks. What do you think the Carboniferous is named after? It's named after carbon. It's where all the coal's from, right? It's as simple as that. Now, if you're in the States, you wouldn't possibly go with a British name, so you don't call it the Carboniferous. You split the Carboniferous into two and call it Pennsylvanian and Mississippian, right? Again, nothing to do with millions of years. Everything to do with where they were first studied. Can you see all the layers? Yes. Yeah. Okay, Carboniferous rocks around 300 million years old. And no change whatsoever. 300 million years, and we have no evidence of evolution. All right, well, let's step it up a little bit further, because now we can come to the Cambrian stromatolites from Morocco. There they are. Can you see? This is actually a complete one. It would have actually sat like that, and you can see all the layers inside of it, where it's built up over time as it's secreting this rock. You have a lovely stromatolite, and this is supposed to be 500 million years old. Hey, that was the oldest one over there, wasn't it? 500 million years, and no supposed evolution. Now we start to get a bit controversial, because we go even older. The Archean butterstone from Africa. The layers, you see the layers in there? Now, this is interpreted as a stromatolite. Now, there's contention over whether it actually is a stromatolite or not, because scientists keep reclassifying the rocks, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But let's assume, for the sake of the argument, that this is what the standard scientists, secular orthodox geologists believe, and this is a stromatolite. This is supposed to be 2,500 million years old. That's 2.5 billion years. These are supposed to be one of the first things ever to have evolved on the planet. Guess what it is? A stromatolite. It hasn't changed. It's supposedly the first ever thing to evolve on the planet. 2.5 billion years, and they're still alive today. Now, let me just show you how arbitrary these dates actually are. This is a Bolivian stromatolite. It's one of the best examples of a stromatolite that we have. You see it? It's beautiful. Look at all those layers where it's built up. It's a really pretty piece of fossil. Now, 3 years ago, I would have stood up and I would have said that according to orthodox geology, secular science, this is the oldest stromatolite. Supposedly 3.7 billion years old. Bear in mind that the Earth is only supposed to be 4.5 billion years old. These rocks were classified as in the Precambrian, right down the bottom, as some of the lowest rocks in all the world, supposedly 3.7 billion years. 2 years ago, however, they reclassified this rock. And they said it's not 3.7 billion years, it's only 70 million years. It's a huge difference. Massive difference. What was the argument? It was based on a single crystal that they found, which they argued meant that it couldn't be Precambrian, it had to be Cretaceous. and it's hotly debated. But it just shows you how arbitrary these dates are, how little these dates mean in reality. Because again, the point is simple. If you want to make this 3.7 billion years old, then really there's no evidence for evolution there. But even if you want to make it 70 million years old, there's no evidence for evolution there whatsoever. So again, it doesn't matter about the dates. All you can see is that creatures reproduce after their own kind. Supposedly from the oldest rocks to the most modern rocks, there's no evidence of evolution. So guess what? You simply don't need the time. You simply don't need the dates. But let's go one step further. I hope you all realise here today that you are designed to not evolve. Let me say that again. You are designed to not evolve. Why? Because how do we reproduce ourselves? Well, we have babies. And babies carry part of our DNA. Part from the mum, part from the dad. It carries part of the DNA. And the DNA comes by reproducing the DNA, duplicating it, making copies of the DNA. That's how your cells reproduce, so you can get bigger and stronger and grow. And that's how, in a slightly different but just a special way, your DNA reproduces itself, copies itself, so that you can have babies. Now you realise that during that copying process, your DNA has a mechanism to stop itself from changing, to stop mistakes from happening. Now, sadly, we live in a fallen world. The Bible says that man sinned, sin and death entered the world. As a result, we are a fallen world, and things like mutations do actually happen today. And it's sad because mutations usually produce very bad results. It produces people with no arms. It produces people with holes in their heart. It produces people who are blind. It's not good. But mutations are supposed to be the driving force of evolution. Mutations are supposed to produce changes in the DNA, which produces a new trait in the animal. Natural selection takes its course, eliminates anything that's unfit, and a new creature is able to go on to develop and evolve. The problem is, of course, is that we have a mechanism to stop ourselves from evolving. It's designed to stop mutations from happening. So the very driving force of evolution, or what's supposed to be the very driving force of evolution, we're actually designed to stop. And you can see this in action because even though we're in a fallen world, even though we mutate, even though we become diseased and we break down, if in 4.5 billion years, or 3.7 billion years rather, you haven't changed, what have you just proven? DNA is doing its job. It's stopping things from evolving. How would it do that? It could only come about by a design. Because nature can't produce this. Nature can't produce the mechanism. A design, by definition, is when something has properties that do not come from the materials that it's made of. That means you need a creator. And so really what you're looking at evidence is that these things were created, they were commanded by God to reproduce after their own kind, and the DNA has been doing that brilliantly ever since God first created it. So it doesn't matter whether you want to make this 3.7 billion years old or just a few thousand years old. All you've proven is that the Bible is true from the very beginning. But then we shouldn't be surprised because in Psalm 119, verse 160, it says, and I quote from the King James because it's beautiful, "Thy word is true from the very beginning." And it really is. Even in evidence in these weird little things like stromatolites. All right, let's move on a little down. Again, I want you to just have a little bit of a walk down and have a look more at the living fossils. We'll meet at the end to talk about change. So you can see lots of examples of living fossils on the table. Everything from crabs to sunfish to starfish to sand dollars to all sorts. And we could be here all day talking through examples, but I want to highlight two particular points. The first one is the coelacanth. You see our big model of the coelacanth fish here? Now, coelacanth is interesting because for many years it was only known from fossils. We actually have a fossil of the coelacanth and some of the fins of the fossil fins of the coelacanth as well. And the fossils were quite interesting because it was clearly an unusual fish. It had big, stumpy fins. And they had hard bones in them. And most fish don't have hard bones in their fins. And so because it was only known from the fossils and because it was believed that these fish went extinct nearly 150 million years ago, the argument was that these fish, the coelacanth, was a transitional form, a link between producing bony fins which would go on to produce bony legs so that the coelacanth could crawl out of the sea and walk. It was claimed that the coelacanth was a missing link, part of the evolutionary history of fish to tetrapods. Those are creatures that can come out and walk on the land. And then, in the early 1900s, a scientist noticed a coelacanth. He found one in a South African fish market because they were still alive and well, and they live off the coast of South Africa, and we can go and see them today. So number one, they haven't gone extinct. What does that make them? A living fossil. Number two, guess where it lives? In the deep sea at the bottom. It's not even close to the land, even if it wanted to get out and walk. And guess what the fins are? Fins. They're not used for walking. They're not even close to being turned into legs. So again, be wary of any argument that says, we've found a fossil that shows evolutionary history, because the coelacanth is a classic example of a misinterpretation. And in fact, you only come to that conclusion because you start with the assumption that fish grew legs and walked onto the land, and so when you find an unusual looking fin, you assume that it must be evidence of fish doing that. The reality is the coelacanth is a fish. A slightly unusual fish perhaps, but there's plenty of unusual fish in the sea. You just have to watch a David Attenborough documentary on it, right? It's amazing. So be wary of things like that, and the coelacanth is a great example of a living fossil. But I do want to talk about change, because there is evidence in the fossil record that there has been some change. And we spoke about it briefly yesterday, so for those of you, I'm afraid I will be repeating myself a little bit. Here is a fossil ginkgo leaf. The ginkgos are fantastic. They come from Asia. They probably would have gone extinct if it hadn't been for the Buddhist monks who preserved them and looked after them. And today the ginkgo leaves are called, the ginkgo plants are called Ginkgo biloba. They're called Ginkgo biloba because they have two lobes. It's as simple as that, right? And you can see from the fossil example as well, they're very, very similar. This is supposedly quite a young fossil. It's only supposed to be about 10 million years old, which is young in fossil sense, supposed ages of fossil sense, but it's pretty similar to the modern ones that you find, Ginkgo biloba. But if you go back to the Jurassic at a supposed 178 million years old, to Whitby, you find that there are ginkgos there as well, but they look a little bit different. Can you see all the long fronds? It's not two lobes, it's lots of lobes. In fact, they had a big bulk at the bottom which branched out into multiple lobes, a big leaf. And today they only have two lobes. So have these plants changed? Yes, they have. They've gone from multiple lobes to two lobes. Is that evolution? Well, what does evolution teach us? Evolution teaches that we start down here and we build upwards, molecules to man. Over millions of years, ape-like creatures can become less hairy, learn to talk, and design computer games. That's what evolution teaches, because evolution teaches that we evolved from ape-like ancestors. Is that what is happening with the ginkgo? No. The ginkgo started up here with bigger leaves and bigger fronds and has lost the information to have them to the point where now it only has two lobes. In fact, we've been able to isolate the gene. We have found the gene that produces the lobes, and it is shortened drastically, which means that in the past it was much bigger. But then it shouldn't be surprised, because what do we find in the past? Long-lobed ginkgos. So just because you find change doesn't necessarily equal the same thinking of evolution as Charles Darwin promoted. And you know this because Charles Darwin observed change. He observed change in the finch beaks of the Galapagos Islands. And he said, hey, I've noticed small amounts of change. If small amounts of change can happen over small amounts of time, then surely large amounts of change must happen over large amounts of time. But the reality is, all the change that we've seen in the world today, all the change that we've seen in the fossil record, it's all the result of a loss of information. There's no gaining of information, there's no building new information, there's no building new traits. It is a loss of information. They are losing an ability and are selecting from pre-existing information. So just because something changes doesn't actually mean that it's evolved. In fact, if you want to really drive this home, from the fossil record you find three examples. And these are the only three examples you see from the fossil record. Number one, creatures remain exactly the same, and we call them the living fossils. Creatures do change, like the ginkgo, but it's not an evolution, it's a devolution, and in fact, even by secular standards, the ginkgo is a living fossil. Certainly the same genus, and what does genus equal to? Kind. Or you find that creatures go extinct, like the dinosaurs appeared to have. You realise not one of three of those is any help for evolution in the slightest? If you've remained exactly the same for 500 million, 3.5 billion years, you're not evolving at all. You provide no evidence that creatures have changed or that creatures are going to change. If you have changed but you haven't evolved, you've devolved, then you're not evolving, you're going the wrong way. And if you go extinct, you couldn't evolve even if you wanted to, because you're now dead. Not one of those three things is any help to evolution in the slightest. All right, well, let's move on and have a look at some more of these fossils. These are all plant examples on here, but notice towards the end of this table, towards the left-hand side, there's some excellent evidence of flood burial, and I want you to see if you can work out what the evidence of flood burial is. So come and have a look, and then we'll gather over here by the chairs. On this table, you notice the flood evidence? Deep-sea creatures like the ammonite buried next to living fossils like the southern conifer. In fact, quite a lot of these plant fossils are the southern conifer. It's known as the Araucaria. It still is growing today in Australia and in the southern hemisphere, and there's one form of Araucaria that can just about cope with our climate. It's called the monkey puzzle tree, which comes from South America. This is a fossil Araucaria from the Jurassic rocks in Germany, where they don't live today, so it must be warmer there in the past. Secondly, it is a living fossil, about 155 million years and no evolution, but it's also buried next to a deep-sea creature. Now, how did that happen? Well, either the deep-sea creature, the fish, grew wings and flew through the forest, or water actually brought the two things together. And if water's bringing the two things together, sea creatures and land plants, you're looking at evidence of a flood. It's the same with the living fossil tree fern buried next to the fish. Tree ferns live in the jungle. The fish live in the sea. They don't belong together. They must have been washed into place by a flood. We have examples of the southern conifer, a giant southern conifer tree trunk from the Isle of Portland in the UK. We have the famous Whitby jet, which is the southern conifer fossilised so hard it turns shiny, and it's buried next to creatures like the belemnites, the deep-sea squids. What are they doing together? Must be a flood. More living fossils of Araucaria, and of course the cycad fossils as well, the famous Australian cycad fossils. But this is perhaps a rather interesting one. It's known as the Wollemi pine. Again, it's a type of Araucaria, it's a type of southern conifer, but again, it was only known from these fossils. It was only known from these fossils in Australia. And you might just be able to see if you get it into the light, it's actually buried next to some fish fossils. There's a slightly better example of a fish fossil on the back. So you have a plant, a tree, a pine, growing, which is really specific to its growth. It struggles to grow in wet or damp environments, and it's buried next to fish. So again, flood burial for sure, but the Wollemi pine was believed to have gone extinct in the Cretaceous about 70 million years ago. That's why it was known as the dinosaur tree. And then it turned up in Wollemi National Park, which is where it got its name from in Australia. I've been to see them. They are beautiful trees, but again, living fossils for sure. So again, even with the fossil plants, you still have evidence of after their kind. Now I'm going to come over here and go straight on to the final point before we wrap up and see if you have any questions. You see, even if a creature in the fossil record is not a living fossil, you still don't have any evidence for evolution. You still have evidence of that biblical concept of after its kind. What am I talking about? Well, here we have the trilobites. The trilobites are so called, well, let's see if we can work out why trilobites are called trilobites. What does tri mean? Three. You all here should have a couple of lobes on your body. Can we find your lobes? There we are, there's a lobe. You know what a lobe is, right? ITE means thing. So the trilobite is a three-lobed thing. In fact, you can count the lobes, 1, 2, 3, on the back there. There they are. 1, 2, 3 lobes. Trilobite, three-lobed thing. Now, the trilobites first appear in the Cambrian, right? The really old rocks, the 500 million year old rocks, supposedly. They go extinct around the Silurian. The Silurian is named after the Silurian tribe in Wales, so again, nothing to do with millions of years. But they're supposed to be around for quite a significant amount of time. And yet, guess what they turn into? Trilobites. In other words, they don't turn into anything, they don't change, they don't evolve, and then they go extinct. Is there any evidence for evolution in the trilobites? No, there isn't. It becomes even worse for the ammonites because you find the ammonites first appear, if you read the geological record as a history of time, they first appear in the Devonian rocks. Anybody want to guess what the Devonian rocks are named after? Devon. It's as simple as that. So the Devonian rocks, where the ammonites first supposedly evolve, and then by the end you find that they go extinct in the Cretaceous at about 65 million years ago, supposedly. And so it actually is for nearly 300 million years ammonites are alive on Earth, according to secular evolution. Do they change in that time? No, they remain ammonites. Do they go extinct? Yes, at the end, so they haven't evolved into anything. In other words, there's no evidence of evolution even in the creatures which are not living fossils. You still find that biblical concept of after their kind even in the creatures which have gone extinct. There is no evidence for evolution in the slightest. Now, to put that into context, right, ammonites were supposed to have been on the Earth for just over 300 million years, and they haven't evolved one bit. We are supposed to have evolved from an ape-like ancestor in around 3 million years. So in just 3 million years, we change from an ape-like creature into a human that can reason, that can talk, that can articulate speech, that can think, that can invent, that can have relationships in a way that apes simply cannot. And we're supposed to be 98% similar. That's perhaps a question for question time. But in just 3 million years, we're supposed to have gone from an ape-like creature into a human. And yet ammonites are around for 300 million years and they don't change. You see, there isn't any evidence for evolution in the rocks whatsoever. The only evidence you can find is that for as long as creatures have been around, whether you want to make that 3.5 billion years, whether you want to make that a few thousand years, the only evidence is that creatures do exactly what God told them to do when he created them, which is reproduce after their own kind. So to finish, a reminder, take off Darwin's glasses, put on God's glasses, make sure you let this mind be in you that is also in Christ, start looking at things God's way, and recognize that the evidence for evolution is simply not there. The evidence for creation is abundant. All right? Hopefully you've enjoyed the talk.